In the unforgiving dust of the Colorado frontier, a woman's worth was often measured solely by the man standing beside her. Alice Higgins stood completely alone, humiliated, passed over not once, not twice, but 7 agonizing times by the men of Oakhaven. She was deemed ruined, a desperate outcast shackled by her father's insurmountable debts. But just as the town prepared to cast her out into the cold for good, the heavy hall doors violently swung open, and in walked a legend of the high ridges, a man who bowed to no one. The frontier town of Oakhaven, Colorado Territory, in the spring of 1878, was a place built on timber, silver dust, and ruthless ambition. It was a town where a man's handshake meant life or death, and a woman's reputation was as fragile as spun glass in a cyclone. For 23-year-old Alice Higgins, that glass had not just shattered, it had been ground into the dirt beneath the polished boots of Oakhaven's high society. Alice was not a conventional frontier beauty. She did not possess the delicate porcelain features or the practiced, vapid giggle of the ranch owners' daughters who spent their days shielded from the harsh western sun. Alice had hands calloused from hauling well water and chopping kindling. She had piercing, observant hazel eyes that missed nothing, set in a face that was strikingly angular and fiercely expressive. Her hair was a deep, unruly auburn that stubbornly escaped its pins, much like Alice's own spirit constantly chafed against the rigid expectations of the town. But it was not her looks that had cast her into the shadows of social exile. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of her father's failures. Thomas Higgins had come to Oakhaven with a dream of striking a silver vein in the jagged foothills. Instead, he found only dead earth and shattered tools. Driven by the desperate hope of a cornered man, Thomas had borrowed heavily from Jeremiah Cobb, the town's sole financier, and a man whose soul was as cold and dark as the bottom of a mine shaft. The debt had ballooned to an astronomical sum of $4,000. When Thomas's health failed, leaving him a coughing, broken shadow of his former self, the burden of survival fell entirely on Alice. She took in mending, scrubbed floors at the local boarding house, and kept the ledgers for the mercantile, fighting tooth and nail to keep a roof over her ailing father's head. But in a town controlled by Jeremiah Cobb, grit was not enough. Cobb wanted the Higgins prime plot of land, located dangerously close to the new proposed railroad spur, and he used Alice's unmarried status as his weapon. "A woman without a husband is a woman without a shield, Miss Higgins," Cobb had sneered at her one afternoon in his opulent office, smoke from his imported cigar thick in the air. "Find a man to take on your father's debt, or I seize the deed by the end of the month. Your father can try his luck surviving the winter in the charity ward." Thus began Alice's descent into the humiliating theater of the Oakhaven marriage mart. Over the course of 2 brutal years, Alice had been systematically presented, evaluated, and discarded. The first was William Parsons, a pragmatic blacksmith who had admired Alice's work ethic. But when Cobb quietly informed William of the exact dollar amount attached to Alice's hand, the blacksmith couldn't look her in the eye the next day, mumbling apologies as he quickly married a baker's daughter instead. The second was a schoolteacher, terrified of Cobb's influence. The third, an older widower named Henry Bowers, sought a mother for his children but was thoroughly intimidated when Alice fiercely defended a stable boy from a beating in the street. He decided he needed a meek wife, not a warrior. The fourth and fifth suitors were run out of town by Cobb's hired thugs before they could even formally state their intentions, a stark message from the banker that anyone who helped the Higgins family would suffer. The sixth rejection had nearly broken her. Arthur Penhaligon, a charismatic young merchant, had sworn he didn't care about Cobb's threats. He and Alice had walked by the river? He had promised her a life free of the crushing anxiety of debt. But on the day he was meant to ask Thomas for Alice's hand, Cobb called in Arthur's own business loans. Arthur left town on the midnight stagecoach without so much as a goodbye note. 6 times, Alice had laid her pride on the chopping block to save her father. 6 times, she had been publicly, agonizingly found wanting. The town gossips, led by the venomous Mrs. Harriet Gable, feasted on her misfortune. Alice was branded as tarnished goods, a cursed woman carrying a plague of bad luck. To To be seen talking to Alice Higgins was to invite the wrath of Jeremiah Cobb and the scorn of polite society. She was drowning, the water rising rapidly above her head, and there was no one left on the shore willing to throw her a rope. The annual Oakhaven Spring Social was the undisputed pinnacle of the town's social calendar. Held in the newly constructed, cavernous timber town hall, it was a night of fiddles, cider, and ruthless matchmaking. Lanterns draped in colorful bunting cast a warm, deceptive glow over the desperate politics of frontier courtship. The unwritten rule of the social was absolute. The final dance of the evening, known as the claiming dance, was when serious intentions were declared. If a man asked a woman for the claiming dance, they were to be married before the first snow. Alice had not wanted to attend. The very thought of walking into that hall, of running the gauntlet of judgmental stares and whispered cruelties, made her stomach violently rebel. But she had no choice. Cobb's deadline was 3 days away. If she did not secure a match tonight, she and her father would be homeless by Monday. She wore her mother's old dress, a dark forest green velvet that Alice had painstakingly altered and repaired. It was outdated by 5 years, severely lacking the ruffled bustles the wealthy girls flaunted, but the rich color made her auburn hair catch the lantern light like dark fire. She held her chin high, masking her terror behind a wall of cold, unapproachable dignity. Her singular hope rested on Josiah Meade. Josiah was a recent arrival from Texas, a ruggedly handsome cattleman who had bought the sprawling Double R Ranch just outside town. Because he was new, his finances were independent of Jeremiah Cobb's bank. For the past 3 weeks, Josiah had been visiting the mercantile where Alice worked. He had lingered at the counter, complimenting her sharp mind, laughing at her dry wit, and listening with genuine interest when she spoke. Just yesterday, he had brushed his hand against hers while paying for nails, his eyes promising something solid and real. "I'll see you at the social, Alice," Josiah had said, his voice a low, comforting drawl. "Save the last dance for me. We have important things to discuss." Those words were a lifeline. As Alice stood near the refreshment table, sipping tepid punch she couldn't taste, her eyes tracked Josiah through the crowded room. He looked incredibly handsome in a tailored broadcloth suit, laughing easily with the mayor. Every time his eyes met Alice's across the room, he offered a small, secret smile. The hours dragged on. Alice politely declined the mocking, insincere dance requests from drunken farmhands, preserving herself for the end of the night. The tension in her chest was a physical ache. She watched Jeremiah Cobb holding court in the corner, his predatory eyes occasionally flicking toward her with smug certainty. Finally, the fiddle player stepped to the front of the makeshift stage, tapping his bow against his boot. "All right, folks," he hollered over the din. "Time for the claiming dance. Gents, go find your ladies." The room shifted as men moved purposefully across the floor. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a step forward, emerging from the shadows of the wall, making herself visible and ready. She saw Josiah excuse himself from the mayor. He turned, his eyes locking onto Alice's. He smiled, a genuine, warm expression, and began to walk toward her. Relief, so profound it nearly brought her to her knees, washed over her. She had done it. She had survived. Her father would be safe. But halfway across the floor, a dark figure intercepted Josiah. It was Jeremiah Cobb. Alice froze, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't hear what was being said over the swell of the fiddle tuning, but she watched with mounting horror as Cobb placed a heavy hand on Josiah's shoulder. Cobb leaned in, whispering directly into the Texan's ear. Josiah's step halted. The warm, confident smile slid off his face, replaced by a pale, sickening look of shock and apprehension. He glanced past Cobb, looking directly at Alice. For one agonizing second, their eyes met. Alice pleaded silently, "Please, please, don't let him do this. You promised." But Josiah Meade was a pragmatic man who had just invested every dime he had into a ranch that relied on Cobb's water rights. He could not afford a war with the town's most powerful man. Josiah swallowed hard, looking away from Alice. He broke eye contact, his shoulders slumping in defeat. With a stiff nod to Cobb, Josiah turned on his heel. He did not walk toward Alice. Instead, he altered his path, walking directly toward the gaggle of wealthy girls across the hall. He stopped in front of Mary Beth Gable, the vapid, giggling daughter of the town gossip, and extended his hand. Mary Beth squealed in delight, taking his arm. Alice stopped breathing. The room seemed to plunge into a suffocating, echoing silence, even as the music swelled into a romantic waltz. Couples swept past her, a dizzying blur of silk and broadcloth. Alice stood utterly alone in the very center of the dance floor. She had stepped out to meet a man who had abandoned her halfway. The humiliation was absolute, a physical blow that left her swaying on her feet. The whispers began instantly, hissing like a nest of vipers over the music. Did you see that? Left standing like a forgotten fence post. That makes 7. 7 men who've realized she's cursed. Cobb finally broke her. Good riddance. Alice looked toward the corner. Jeremiah Cobb raised his glass of bourbon to her in a mock, triumphant salute. It was over. She had lost. The house was gone. Her father's life was forfeit, and she was cemented as the tragic, untouchable joke of Oakhaven. Tears of pure, acidic shame burned the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give Cobb the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her hands trembled violently as she gripped the folds of her green velvet dress. She needed to run. She needed to escape into the freezing night, to hide in the dark where no one could look at her ever again. She took a step backward toward the heavy oak entrance doors, but before she could reach them, the music was abruptly, violently shattered. A sound like thunder cracked through the town hall. The massive double doors at the front of the building didn't just open. They were kicked inward with such terrifying force that the heavy iron hinges shrieked in protest. One of the doors slammed against the wall, splintering the pine paneling. The fiddle screeched to a halt. The dancers froze. The murmuring gossip died in an instant, replaced by a collective, breathless gasp of shock. A freak spring blizzard had been brewing outside, and the violent opening of the doors sucked a howling vortex of wind and biting white snow into the stifling heat of the hall. The lanterns flickered wildly, casting long, menacing shadows across the floorboards. Framed in the doorway, blocking out the storm, stood a man who looked like he had been carved from the very granite of the treacherous Bitterroot Peaks. It was Gideon Cole. He was a myth to the soft townsfolk of Oakhaven. A mountain man, a solitary timber scout, and a master trapper who lived in the lethal, unforgiving high country where the law of the badge gave way to the law of the fang and the gun. Most of the town had never seen him in the flesh. They only whispered stories about him. They said he had survived a winter stranded at Dead Man's Pass by hunting wolves with a knife. They said he had single-handedly slaughtered a camp of cattle rustlers who had tried to steal his horses. Standing at 6'4", his shoulders were impossibly broad, stretching the thick, weather-beaten canvas of his duster coat. Beneath it, he wore dark buckskin and a heavy woolen shirt, smelling intensely of pine resin, wood smoke, and freezing rain. Snow dusted his broad-brimmed hat and clung to his dark, shaggy hair. But it was his face that commanded absolute, terrified attention. It was a rugged, strikingly handsome face, hardened by years of brutal solitude, dominated by a jagged, silvery scar that slashed across his strong jawline, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't lived to tell the tale. His eyes, a piercing, icy shade of slate gray, swept slowly across the terrified room. They were the eyes of an apex predator assessing a flock of nervous sheep. Caleb O'Rourke, the town sheriff, instinctually took a half-step backward, his hand hovering uselessly near his revolver. Even Jeremiah Cobb, who feared no man in a ledger book, suddenly looked incredibly small and pale in the corner. Gideon Cole stepped fully into the hall, his heavy, wolfskin boots thudding against the floorboards with ominous finality. He didn't bother closing the doors behind him, letting the wild, freezing wind whip through the room, chilling the sweat on the dancers' necks. "What is the meaning of this?" Cobb finally sputtered, trying to project authority, his voice trembling slightly. "Cole, you have no business here. This is a private civic function." Gideon didn't even look at the banker. He didn't acknowledge the sheriff, nor the mayor. His slate-gray eyes had stopped moving. They had locked onto the solitary figure standing in the center of the floor, trembling in a threadbare green velvet dress. He saw Alice. In that frozen moment, Alice couldn't breathe. She was acutely aware of her own pathetic appearance, abandoned, humiliated, fighting back tears. She expected this terrifying giant of a man to sneer, to walk past her to the bar, to treat her like the invisible, damaged goods the rest of the town believed her to be. Instead, Gideon Cole began to walk toward her. The crowd instinctively parted for him, scrambling out of his way like water fleeing a stone. The wealthy ranchers pulled their daughters back. Josiah Meade shrank into the shadows. The sheer physical presence of the mountain man was overwhelming, rolling off him in waves of raw, untamed power. He stopped directly in front of Alice. Up close, he was even more massive. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The scent of him, wild earth, cold snow, and raw leather, completely overpowered the cloying perfume of the hall. Alice's heart pounded fiercely in her throat. She braced herself for cruelty, raising her chin, her hazel eyes flashing with a desperate, defensive fire. She would not cower, not even before the devil of the Bitterroots. Gideon looked down at her. His icy eyes mapped the fierce pride in her posture, the redness rimming her eyes, and the defiant set of her jaw. He saw exactly what had just happened. He saw the isolation, the cruelty, and the extraordinary, unbreakable iron in this woman's spine that kept her standing upright. A profound, absolute stillness settled between them, a sudden eye in the center of the room's storm. Slowly, deliberately, Gideon reached up and pulled off his heavy leather gloves, tucking them into his belt. He extended his massive, scarred hand toward Alice. The palm was rough with calluses, a hand that knew brutal labor and unforgiving violence. "You look like you're owed a dance," Gideon rumbles, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Alice's chest. "And I need a reason not to burn this miserable town to the ground." The collective gasp from the room was deafening. Harriet Gable actually swooned, clutching a pillar. Jeremiah Cobb turned the color of curdled milk. Gideon Cole, the most dangerous man within 300 miles, a man who possessed no debt, answered to no law, and held thousands of acres of unmined mountain territory, was publicly claiming the pariah of Oakhaven. Alice stared at his large, outstretched hand. Her mind raced. This wasn't a pity dance. There was no pity in Gideon Cole's eyes. There was only absolute certainty, and a dark, blazing challenge leveled at every single person in that room who had wronged her. She looked past his broad shoulder, locking eyes with Jeremiah Cobb. The banker was shaking his head frantically, mouthing the word no. If Alice took the mountain man's hand, Cobb lost all his leverage. He lost the land. He lost his power over her. Alice brought her gaze back to the wild, scarred face of Gideon Cole. A spark of terrifying, exhilarating hope ignited in her chest, burning away the shame of 7 rejections in a single heartbeat. With a steady, deliberate motion, Alice raised her hand and placed it firmly into Gideon's. His long fingers closed around hers, warm and solid as bedrock. "I believe I am owed a dance, Mr. Cole," Alice said, her voice ringing out clear and unwavering in the silent hall. Gideon's lips twitched upward into a small, dangerous smile. He pulled her flush against his solid chest, one hand dropping securely to the small of her back. He turned his head and shot a glare at the terrified fiddle player. "Play," Gideon commanded. The musician scrambled to raise his bow, wildly sawing out a waltz. Gideon Cole swept Alice Higgins across the floor, moving with surprising, deadly grace for a man of his size. The rest of the town could only watch in stunned, horrified silence as the unwanted spinster and the savage king of the mountains danced in the center of the storm. And for the first time in 2 years, Alice Higgins felt completely, untouchably safe. The waltz seemed to stretch into eternity, yet ended far too soon. For 3 agonizing, transcendent minutes, Alice Higgins was not a debtor's daughter, nor the town pariah. She was the absolute center of gravity in a room that had spent 2 years trying to erase her. Gideon Cole moved with a rhythmic, powerful grace that defied his massive frame. He did not speak, but his slate-gray eyes never left her face, holding her gaze with an intensity that made the rest of the crowded hall blur into insignificance. When the fiddler finally drew his bow across the strings for the final, trembling chord, the silence that followed was suffocating. Not a single person clapped. The tension in the Oakhaven town hall was thick enough to choke a horse. Gideon released Alice's waist, but kept her hand firmly engulfed in his. He turned slowly, his broad shoulders shielding her, and faced the crowd. The townsfolk shrank back, their eyes wide with a mixture of morbid curiosity and primal fear. Then, the sharp, angry clapping of a single man broke the silence. Jeremiah Cobb pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face mottled with purple rage. The veins in his neck pulsed against his stiff white collar. He had built his empire in Oakhaven on control and fear, and this mountain savage was dismantling it with a single dance. "A very touching spectacle, Cole," Cobb sneered, though he wisely kept a distance of 10 paces. "But this isn't one of your lawless mountain camps. There are rules here, contracts, obligations. The claiming dance requires the man to take on the woman's burdens, and Miss Higgins comes with a very heavy burden indeed." Gideon didn't flinch. "Speak plainly, banker. I don't have all night." Cobb puffed out his chest, glancing at the crowd to ensure they were witnessing his authority. "Thomas Higgins owes the Oakhaven Mutual Trust exactly $4,216, due by Monday at noon. If you are formally claiming his daughter, you are claiming that debt. And I know for a fact a filthy timber scout doesn't have that kind of capital. So, unhand the girl, walk out those doors, and go back to the mud where you belong." Alice squeezed Gideon's hand, her stomach plummeting. $4,000 was a king's ransom, a cattle baron's fortune. It was a sum so impossibly large that a man living in the remote peaks of the Bitterroots could never hope to possess it. She prepared to let go of his hand, to spare him the humiliation that was rightfully hers. But Gideon's grip tightened, anchoring her to his side. A slow, chilling rumble resonated in his chest, a laugh utterly devoid of humor. "Phineas Reed," Gideon called out, his booming voice echoing off the rafters. From the back of the room, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed glasses jumped. He was the town assayer. Yes, Mr. Cole? Bring your scales to the refreshment table, now." Phineas scrambled to obey, rushing to his office next door and returning moments later with a brass scale and a set of iron counterweights. He cleared away the punch bowl with trembling hands. Gideon led Alice toward the table, the crowd parting for them like the Red Sea. He reached his free hand into the deep, heavy pockets of his canvas duster. One by one, he pulled out 4 thick, grease-stained leather pouches, their bottoms bulging with profound weight. He dropped them onto the wooden table. Thud, 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 thud. The heavy, metallic sound sent a shockwave through the room. Gideon untied the rawhide string of the first pouch and tipped it over the assayer's brass weighing pan. A cascade of dull, glittering yellow spilled out. It wasn't gold dust. They were raw, thumb-sized nuggets of pure placer gold, violently ripped from the bedrock of the high mountain streams. The crowd erupted in frantic whispers. Cobb's jaw went entirely slack, his arrogant sneer melting into an expression of profound, sickly disbelief. "Weigh it, Phineas," Gideon commanded. The assayer's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his weights. He spent 5 agonizing minutes calibrating the scale, moving from the first pouch to the second, then the third. When he finally looked up, he was sweating profusely in the freezing draft, still blowing through the open doors. "Well?" Cobb barked, his voice cracking in panic. I can't be precise without a chemical wash," Phineas stammered, wiping his brow. "But at current Denver exchange rates of $18 an ounce, Mr. Cobb, there is roughly $7,000 worth of raw gold on this table." A woman in the back fainted dead away. Josiah Meade stared at the gold with undisguised envy and deep, bitter regret. Gideon didn't even look at the gold. He looked at Cobb. $4,216 pays the Higgins note. The rest buys the deed to the Higgins property outright, clear of your greedy hands. You will draft the papers tonight. If I find out you've tried to cheat the old man out of a single square inch, I will come back down this mountain. And I won't be asking for a dance." Cobb opened his mouth to argue, but the murderous, dead-eyed promise in the mountain man's gaze silenced him instantly. Defeated, humiliated in front of the very town he ruled, the banker turned and pushed his way out of the hall, practically running into the snowy night. Gideon turned his back on the gold, leaving it in the care of the terrified assayer, and finally looked down at Alice. The storm outside howled, but Alice felt as if she were standing in the warm sun. "Why?" Alice whispered, her voice trembling for the first time all evening. "You don't even know me. Why would you pay a fortune for a woman you've never spoken to?" Gideon reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair from her cheek. The tenderness of the gesture was wildly at odds with his rugged exterior. "I've known you for 6 months, Alice," he said softly, his gravelly voice meant only for her ears. "I come down to the mercantile for supplies once a month. I watched you balance those ledgers while the owner berated you. I watched you stand between a drunken drover and a bleeding stable boy back in October, holding nothing but a pitchfork. I watched you walk into this town every day with your head held high while these cowards whispered behind your back." Alice's breath hitched. He had seen her. When she thought she was entirely invisible, this ghost of the mountains had been watching her. "I don't need a soft woman to embroider pillows," Gideon continued, his slate eyes burning with raw honesty. "I live in a brutal place. The winters are unforgiving, the work is endless, and the isolation drives weak minds mad. I need a partner with iron in her spine. I need a woman who knows how to survive. I watched 7 weak men walk away from you, Alice Higgins. But I am not a weak man." He took a step back and slowly, formally, removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "My cabin sits on a high ridge in the Bitterroots. It's yours, if you want it. I am asking you to be my wife. We leave at first light." Alice looked around the room. She saw the judgmental faces of the town gossips, now contorted with jealousy. She saw the men who had deemed her worthless, now realizing they couldn't afford the dirt on her shoes. Then she looked at the towering, scarred man before her, offering her not just rescue, but profound, unconditional respect. "Yes, Mr. Cole," Alice said, her voice ringing with newfound, unbreakable strength. "I will marry you." The wedding was as swift and practical as the man Alice was marrying. As the pale, bruised light of dawn crept over the Colorado plains, Judge Hiram Miller stood shivering in the Higgins' small parlor, rapidly reading the vows. There were no flowers, no white lace, and no celebratory breakfast. Alice wore a sturdy canvas riding skirt and her father's heavy wool coat. Thomas Higgins sat in his armchair, weeping openly, but they were tears of profound relief. Gideon had not merely paid the debt. He had arranged for a private coach to take Thomas to the St. Luke's Respiratory Clinic in Denver, paying for a year of world-class medical care in advance. "You take care of my girl, Cole," the old man rasped, gripping Gideon's massive forearm with weak, trembling hands. "With my life, sir," Gideon swore. And Alice, looking at the grim determination in her new husband's eyes, knew it was the absolute truth. By sunrise, Oakhaven was a fading speck in the valley below. The journey up to the Bitterroots was treacherous. They rode single file along Cutter's Ridge, a notoriously narrow switchback trail that hugged the sheer granite cliffs. Gideon rode point on a massive black stallion named Thunder, while Alice followed on a sturdy roan mare, leading 2 pack mules loaded with supplies. The air grew brutally thin and biting cold as they ascended past the timberline. The sweeping plains were replaced by jagged peaks of ancient stone and deep, impenetrable forests of black pine. It was an alien, terrifying world, entirely disconnected from the polite society Alice had fought so hard to belong to. Yet, listening to the steady, reassuring creak of Gideon's saddle leather ahead of her, Alice felt an unexpected surge of freedom. For 2 days they climbed, making camp in sheltered rock outcroppings. Around the roaring campfires, the silence between them began to thaw. Gideon was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with purpose. He taught her how to read the tracks of elk in the snow, how to tell when a storm was brewing by the color of the bruised sky, and how to fire the heavy Winchester rifle he kept in his saddle scabbard. "The mountain doesn't care if you're a man or a woman," Gideon told her on the second night, handing her a tin cup of strong, black coffee. It only cares if you're paying attention. Alice absorbed every lesson like a sponge. She found herself watching the powerful play of muscles beneath his shirt as he chopped firewood, the firelight catching the silvery scar on his jaw. He was a frightening man to the world, but to her, he was becoming a pillar of absolute safety. But down in the valley, Jeremiah Cobb was a man poisoned by his own humiliation. He had lost the Higgins land, but the sight of $7,000 in raw gold nugget had ignited a feverish, blinding greed in his black heart. If a savage like Gideon Cole could pull that much gold from the dirt, Cobb reasoned, there was a fortune to be had on that mountain ridge. Cobb didn't send the law. He sent Boyd Tucker. Tucker was a ruthless cutthroat, a man who made his living hijacking silver shipments and intimidating homesteaders. Cobb paid him and 2 heavily armed drifters to track the newlyweds up the mountain, eliminate Gideon, and claim the mining rights from a conveniently widowed Alice. The ambush happened on the 3rd morning, just as the trail narrowed through a deep, rocky gorge known as Dead Man's Defile. Alice was riding 10 paces behind Gideon, admiring the breathtaking view of a frozen waterfall, when the pristine silence was shattered by the deafening crack of a rifle. Snow exploded from the boulder, inches from Gideon's head. His stallion reared violently, screaming in panic. "Get down!" Gideon roared, pulling his horse hard to the left behind a massive slab of fallen granite. Before Alice could react, a second shot rang out. She heard a sickening thud, and Gideon cursed violently, his hand flying to his left shoulder. Blood rapidly bloomed across the dark canvas of his coat. "Gideon!" Alice screamed, throwing herself off her roan mare and scrambling over the icy rocks to reach him. "Stay back!" he ordered, drawing his heavy Colt revolver with his good hand. His face was pale, his teeth gritted in agony, but his eyes were ablaze with lethal fury. From the ridge above them, 50 yards up the gorge, 3 men emerged from the timber. Boyd Tucker stood in the center, jacking another round into his repeating rifle. "Give it up, Cole!" Tucker shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Leave the woman and the mules, and maybe we let you bleed out in peace." Gideon was pinned down. If he leaned out to fire, they had the high ground and superior cover. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. The situation was desperate, and Alice knew it. She looked at her husband, bleeding into the snow. She thought of the 7 men in Oakhaven who had turned their backs on her. She thought of Jeremiah Cobb, sitting in his warm office, pulling the strings of her misery. And a fierce, volcanic rage erupted in Alice's chest. She was done being the victim. She was done waiting for men to decide her fate. Without a word, Alice dropped to her stomach and low-crawled back toward her terrified roan mare, which was pinned against the canyon wall. "Alice, what are you doing? Stay down!" Gideon hissed. Ignoring him, she reached up and snatched the Winchester rifle from the saddle scabbard. She checked the chamber, just as Gideon had taught her the night before. Her hands were shaking, but her vision was crystal clear. She scrambled up a steep embankment of loose shale to their right, putting a thick deadwood pine between herself and the attackers. She was no longer in their direct line of sight, but she had a flanking angle on the ridge above. She rested the heavy barrel of the Winchester in the crook of a thick branch. She closed her left eye, aligning the iron sights squarely on the chest of the man standing to Boyd Tucker's left. She remembered Gideon's deep voice in the firelight. "Breathe out. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." Alice exhaled a white cloud of breath into the freezing air and squeezed. The Winchester roared, kicking back hard into her shoulder. On the ridge, the drifter screamed, dropping his rifle as Alice's bullet shattered his collarbone, spinning him backward into the snow. "Where did that come from?" Tucker yelled in panic, whirling toward Alice's position. The distraction was all Gideon needed. With the covering fire shifting Tucker's attention, Gideon pushed himself out from behind the granite slab. Despite his shattered shoulder, his aim with the heavy Colt was terrifyingly precise. Bang! Bang! 2 shots in rapid succession. The second drifter caught a bullet in the throat, collapsing instantly. Boyd Tucker gasped, dropping his rifle as Gideon's second bullet took him squarely in the chest. Tucker stood frozen for a second, a look of profound shock on his face, before tumbling forward over the ledge, his body crashing into the gorge below. The echo of the gunfire faded, replaced only by the howling mountain wind and the frantic snorting of the horses. Alice lowered the smoking rifle, her chest heaving, the adrenaline making her entire body vibrate. She scrambled down the shale and ran to Gideon. He was leaning heavily against the rock, his face ashen, clutching his bleeding shoulder. But as Alice approached, rifle still in hand, powder burns on her cheek, his slate-gray eyes widened in absolute astonishment. He looked at the dead men on the ridge, then looked back at his new wife. He let out a breathless, painful chuckle. "I told you," Gideon rasped, a fierce, proprietary pride bleeding into his gravelly voice. "I needed a woman with iron in her spine." Alice dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside him, pressing her scarf hard against his bleeding wound. "You talk too much, Mr. Cole," she said, tears of adrenaline and relief finally spilling over her cheeks. "Now be quiet so I can patch you up. We have a mountain to climb." Gideon reached up with his blood-stained hand, cupping her face, pulling her down to kiss her. It tasted of gunpowder, copper, and desperate survival. In the shadow of the deadly gorge, surrounded by the bodies of the men sent to destroy them, the outcast of Oakhaven and the savage of the Bitterroots forged a bond that no banker, no society, and no mountain could ever break. The rest of the ascent was a grueling test of endurance. With her husband bleeding and drifting in and out of a feverish consciousness, Alice Higgins, now Alice Cole, was forced to take the lead. She bound Gideon's shoulder with torn strips of her own petticoats, packing the wound with pine pitch to staunch the bleeding, a desperate trick she had once read about in a trapper's journal. For 2 days, she led the horses through blinding squalls and treacherous icy switchbacks, refusing to let Gideon slip from the saddle. When they finally breached the tree line, emerging onto a high, flat plateau known to the locals as Eagle's Anvil, Alice saw her new home. It was not a mere shack, as the gossips of Oakhaven had gleefully predicted. It was a fortress, built from massive, hand-hewn logs of Douglas fir and sealed with thick clay. The cabin sat nestled against a sheer rock face that protected it from the brutal northern winds. Smoke curled invitingly from a heavy stone chimney. Attached to the main cabin was a sturdy, weatherproof barn, already stocked with cured hay and dried venison. Alice practically carried Gideon inside. The interior was remarkably clean and well-ordered, smelling of cedar, dried sage, and gun oil. Heavy furs lined the floor, and a massive iron stove dominated the center of the room. It was the home of a man who demanded discipline from himself and his surroundings. For the next 3 weeks, as the first true blizzards of the winter hammered the Bitterroots, Alice fought a relentless war against infection and death. She boiled snow for water, steeped willow bark for fever tea, and carefully cleaned the gunshot wound twice a day. She chopped the firewood, fed the stock, and kept the hearth burning. The soft, humiliated girl who had stood trembling at the Oakhaven Spring Social was gone, burned away by the harsh reality of mountain survival. One evening in late November, the fever finally broke. Gideon opened his slate-gray eyes to find Alice sitting in a rocking chair by the stove, asleep with his heavy hunting knife resting in her lap. The sight of her, her auburn hair braided practically, her hands rough and stained with soot, guarding him like a lioness, struck a chord deep within his chest, a place that had been frozen solid since the day a grizzly had nearly torn his face off. "You didn't run," Gideon rasped, his voice weak but clear. Alice jerked awake, her hand instantly tightening on the knife handle before she realized he was looking at her. A profound, overwhelming relief washed over her face. She set the blade aside and rushed to the bed, pouring a cup of water and holding it to his chapped lips. "Where would I run to, Mr. Cole?" she asked softly, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "Besides, you owe me a proper honeymoon, and I intend to collect." Over the long, isolated winter months, the cabin on Eagle's Anvil became a sanctuary of unexpected warmth. Confined to the hearth by the 10-foot snowdrifts outside, Gideon and Alice finally had time to truly know one another. Gideon proved to be a man of surprising intellect, possessing a trunk full of worn books ranging from philosophy to agricultural science. He taught her how to play chess with hand-carved wooden pieces. She taught him how to read the complex double-entry accounting ledgers he had clumsily tried to maintain. It was during these quiet, firelit nights that the true story of Gideon Cole was laid bare. "I wasn't always a savage," Gideon murmured one night, staring into the glowing embers. "I was an engineer back in Pennsylvania. Came west with my brother, Samuel, looking to build bridges. Samuel caught gold fever instead. We found a cavern up here. Not a vein you have to mine, but an ancient, dried-up underground riverbed littered with heavy nuggets. We were rich beyond comprehension." Gideon paused, his jaw tightening, the scar turning rigid. "We made the mistake of going down to a town much like Oakhaven to celebrate. Flashed our gold. The town sheriff and his deputies followed us back up. They ambushed us in our sleep. They killed Samuel. I barely survived the grisly attack that happened a week later while I was crawling through the snow, half dead from a bullet wound." Alice reached out, taking his large, scarred hand in hers, holding it tight. "I swore then," Gideon continued, looking into Alice's eyes, "that I would never trust the polite society of towns again. Men in suits and badges are far more dangerous than any wolf. I built this cabin. I took back the gold from the men who killed my brother, and I buried them on the ridge. I lived alone because I thought all people were corrupted by greed. Until I saw you, Alice. Until I saw a woman who would rather starve with her father than sell her soul to Jeremiah Cobb." Historical records from the Cole family diaries, now preserved under strict climate control in the Colorado State Archives, reveal that it was during this brutal winter that Alice and Gideon's marriage shifted from a partnership of survival into a fiercely passionate, undeniable love. They were two outcasts, hardened by the cruelty of the world, who had finally found absolute safety in each other's arms. Spring arrived in the Bitterroots, not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent cracking of ice and the roaring of flooded streams. By May of 1879, the trails were finally passable. Gideon's shoulder had healed into a thick, knotted scar, and he was back to his full, terrifying strength. Down in the valley, however, the town of Oakhaven was dying. The silver veins that had built the town proved to be shallow. By midwinter, the miners had hit solid granite. The panic was instantaneous. Without silver, the lumber mills stopped. Without the mills, the saloons and mercantile closed. The wealthy ranchers who had sneered at Alice suddenly found themselves holding worthless deeds. But no one suffered a steeper fall than Jeremiah Cobb. As the town's economy collapsed, a run on the Oakhaven Mutual Trust began. Panicked citizens demanded their savings. But Cobb, fueled by his humiliating defeat at the spring social, had foolishly gambled the bank's reserves on fraudulent railroad bonds, desperately trying to double his fortune to buy up the mountain land where he believed Gideon's gold was hidden. The vault was empty. Realizing he was facing the wrath of a lynch mob, Cobb made a fatal, desperate decision. In the dead of night, he emptied the last remaining safety deposit boxes, stealing the remaining wealth of the very people who had once kissed his boots, and fled into the wilderness on horseback. He didn't ride east toward civilization. In his maddened state, he rode north, up into the Bitterroots, still obsessively convinced he could find Gideon Cole's legendary gold cavern and buy his way to a new life in California. Cobb's timing could not have been worse. A freak late-spring blizzard caught him halfway up Cutter's Ridge. His stolen horse, unaccustomed to the treacherous footing, threw a shoe and snapped its leg. Cobb was left on foot, dragging a heavy canvas sack of stolen jewelry and cash through 3 feet of fresh, blinding snow. 3 days later, Alice Cole was out checking the snares near the edge of Eagle's Anvil. She wore a tailored buckskin jacket Gideon had made for her, carrying her Winchester rifle with casual expertise. Her keen eyes caught a splash of unnatural dark blue against a snowbank. She approached cautiously, keeping her rifle raised. Huddled beneath the roots of a fallen pine, frostbitten, starving, and half-delirious, was Jeremiah Cobb. His expensive broadcloth suit was in tatters. His lips were blue, his fingers blackened with frostbite, clutching the canvas sack of stolen money as if it could keep him warm. Cobb looked up, his sunken, crazed eyes focusing on the woman standing over him. He expected to see the grim reaper. Instead, he saw the woman he had tormented, the woman he had tried to destroy. She did not look like a victim anymore. She looked like the queen of the mountain, radiant, healthy, and untouchable. "Help me," Cobb wheezed, his voice a pathetic, rattling gasp. "I have money. I can pay you." Alice stared down at him. A year ago, this man held the power of life and death over her. He had orchestrated her 7 humiliations. He had sent killers to murder her husband. The easiest thing in the world would be to leave him here to freeze, a fitting end for a cold-hearted tyrant. Gideon emerged from the tree line a moment later, having followed Alice's tracks. He saw Cobb. His hand drifted instinctively to the heavy Colt on his hip. "Well," Gideon rumbled, his voice devoid of any mercy. "The trash seems to have hauled itself up the mountain," Cobb whimpered, trying to crawl backward into the snow. Alice placed a gentle hand on Gideon's arm, stopping him from drawing his weapon. She looked back down at the banker. There was no hatred in her hazel eyes, only profound, chilling pity. "We don't need your money, Mr. Cobb," Alice said, her voice echoing crisp and clear in the thin mountain air. "And we are not murderers. We will take you to the warmth. We will feed you. And then we will hand you over." They strapped the half-dead banker to a pack mule. A week later, when the valley passes fully cleared, Gideon and Alice rode down into Denver. They delivered Jeremiah Cobb, along with the sack of stolen Oakhaven funds, directly to the legendary Superintendent David Cook of the Rocky Mountain Detective Association. Cook, a real-life terror to outlaws, ensured Cobb was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at the Territorial Penitentiary in Canyon City. The story of the mountain man and his resilient bride spread like wildfire across the Colorado frontier. The citizens of Oakhaven, those who hadn't fled the ruined town, finally received their stolen savings back, entirely due to the grace of the woman they had cast out. Alice and Gideon Cole never returned to Oakhaven. They didn't need to. They lived out their days in the high, clean air of the Bitterroots, their wealth secured not just by the secret gold cavern, but by an unbreakable bond forged in fire and ice. Alice Higgins had been rejected 7 times by boys pretending to be men. But on the 8th time, the mountain itself had chosen her, and she had conquered it all. What a breathtaking journey of resilience, revenge, and unexpected love. Alice's transformation from an outcast to a fierce frontier queen proves that, sometimes, the society that rejects you is just making room for the legend you are meant to become. If you were captivated by Alice and Gideon's story and love true grit historical dramas, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a great twist. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next epic tale from the wild, untamed frontier. See you in the next one.